Night. 11 p.m. A black Range Rover Sport crunched across the gravel lot of a small auto shop on the outskirts of Charlotte, North Carolina. The woman who stepped out didn't belong here. Power suit, hair pinned tight, briefcase in one hand, car keys in the other. She set the keys on the counter, looked straight at the man wiping grease off his hands, and said exactly one sentence. "I need you to check this car. I'll be back." No name, no phone number, no explanation. An Uber pulled up. Serena Caldwell, CEO of a $1.8 billion logistics empire, walked out of the light and into the dark without looking back. Jake Mercer stood alone, the night air thick with motor oil and something he couldn't name. A thin streak of brake fluid spread beneath the rear axle. Too precise, too clean. In 12 years of fixing cars, he'd seen that pattern once before. The night his wife died. The gravel lot of Mercer's Auto and Repair sat at the edge of a 2-lane road that most Charlotte commuters passed without slowing down. The shop wasn't much to look at, a 2-bay garage with a hand-painted sign of parts shelf, visible through the side window. Tools hung in exact order on a pegboard wall. But everything inside was clean, the kind of clean that came from discipline, not habit. Jake Mercer had built that discipline the hard way. He was 37 with the kind of hands that told a story before he opened his mouth, knuckles scarred from years of steel and heat, but movements deliberate, almost careful, like a man who had learned to slow down after moving too fast for too long. For 9 years, he had worked as a mechanical failure analyst for the National Transportation Safety Board, traveling to crash sites across the country, reading wreckage the way other people read words. He had been good at it. Maybe too good. Then Sarah died, and the job that had once felt like purpose started to feel like the place where he had failed the one person who mattered most. He left the NTSB 3 years ago, moved back to Charlotte, opened the shop, started raising Rosie alone. His daughter was 8 years old and slept on a pull-out sofa in the back room on nights when he had late jobs, a stuffed bear tucked under one arm, homework half finished on the folding table beside her. Jake had never told her why they moved or why the NTSB certification frame on his desk had spent 3 years face down on the wood. He told himself she was too young to understand. The truth was that he was the one who wasn't ready. That was the life he had arranged for himself. Small, controlled, and safe. On the Friday night, Serena Caldwell rolled her Range Rover into his lot and left without giving him her name. He spent 2 hours and 19 minutes on that vehicle. He didn't rush. He started at the front hood, up fluid levels, belt condition, battery terminals, and moved methodically backward through each system the way the NTSB had trained him to, the way that had become so ingrained he still did it even on routine jobs that didn't require it. The front suspension was clean. The steering assembly was fine. The engine bay showed normal wear for the mileage. Nothing that explained a brake pedal anomaly on a highway. He found it when he slid under the chassis and aimed his work light at the rear brake line assembly. The rear hydraulic line had been scored, not cut, not crimped, but scored with a high-precision instrument along a 12-millimeter stretch of steel tubing. The wall of the line had been weakened to roughly 30% of its rated thickness, intact enough to hold under normal city driving the stop-and-go rhythms of surface streets and parking structures, fragile enough to rupture completely under sustained highway pressure. Somewhere between 150 and 200 kilometers of high-speed travel, the kind of distance that put the failure point in the middle of an interstate at speed, with no warning and no time to think. It would have looked like mechanical fatigue, thermal stress maybe, or gradual corrosion from road salt. A shop doing a routine inspection might have pressed the brake pedal, noted normal resistance, and moved on. Jake had not moved on because he had seen this method before. Not in a textbook, not in a training module. In a case file, an NTSB investigation he had opened 3 years ago on a mountain road outside Asheville, on a vehicle that had gone through a guardrail at 61 miles per hour. Sarah's car. He stayed under the chassis for a long time after he found it. The work light hummed. Outside, a truck moved down the two-lane road, and the headlights swept briefly across the shop floor, then disappeared. He thought about the woman who had left the keys without her name. He thought about the way she had looked at him before she walked out. Not like a customer, not like someone in a hurry, like someone confirming something. He pulled himself out and stood up. In the trunk beneath a folded emergency kit, he found two things that had no business being there: a sealed USB drive and an envelope. Both had his name on them. Not Jake, not the mechanic. His full name printed in clean block letters, Jake Mercer's Auto. He set them on the workbench without opening either. Someone had known he was here. Someone had known his name, his shop, and based on the envelope, had placed these items in this car before it arrived tonight. This was not a woman who had stumbled across his lot by accident. This was a woman who had chosen him specifically for reasons she hadn't explained, and then driven a vehicle with a compromised brake line into his custody and walked away. He stood at the workbench and thought about that for a long time. In 9 years with the NTSB, he had learned that the most dangerous moment in any investigation was the one where a person decided the evidence was speaking to them personally. It was the moment investigators made mistakes reading coincidence as conspiracy, reading grief as signal. He had been careful about that distinction for 9 years. He had been less careful the night Sarah died, and it had cost him everything he thought he had built. But this was not a coincidence. His name on an envelope in the trunk of a sabotaged vehicle was not coincidence. It was a message from someone who had needed him specifically and had gone to considerable trouble to find him. Jake looked through the doorway into the back room. Rosie was still asleep, the stuffed bear rising and falling slowly with her breathing. He looked at the envelope on the workbench. Then he looked at the certification frame on his desk, face down the way it had been for 3 years. He crossed the shop, picked it up, and turned it over. The NTSB seal caught the light. He read his own name on the certificate, the way a person reads something they wrote in a different life in handwriting they almost recognize. He set it down right side up. Then he picked up the envelope. Serena Caldwell arrived at 7:45 the following morning, before Jake had unlocked the front door. She was dressed differently than the night before, dark slacks, a gray blazer hair down, but she carried herself the same way, like a person who had decided years ago that hesitation was a luxury she couldn't afford. The composure she wore wasn't the kind that came from comfort. It was the kind that came from practice, from learning to keep her voice level in rooms full of men who were waiting for her to flinch. Her father, Gerald Caldwell, had built Caldwell Logistics Group from a regional trucking fleet into a supply chain company worth $1.8 billion. He had died 14 months ago, a heart attack. Sudden, no warning, and left Serena holding a company that half the board had never believed she was equipped to run. She had spent 14 months proving them wrong, quietly, methodically, the way her father had taught her to do anything worth doing. She had been close to turning the corner when she discovered what Derek Ashford was doing. Derek had been her father's COO for 11 years. Gerald had trusted him completely. Serena had inherited that trust, along with everything else, and she had extended it longer than she should have, because grief does things to a person's judgment that they don't always notice in time. It was only in the past 6 weeks, combing through financial records at 2 in the morning, when the office was empty, that she had found the pattern. Contracts routed through shell intermediaries, asset transfers structured to look like operational expenses, a coordinated plan to hollow out the company's balance sheet before a forced leadership transition, a transition Derek had been quietly building toward for months, working the board 1 member at a time. She had 10 days before the vote. Maybe less. The brake line had changed her timeline. She sat down across from Jake in the small office at the back of the shop, the USB drive and the sealed envelope on the table between them, and she told him about the night before the pedal drop on I-85, the decision to leave the highway, the reason she had chosen his shop and not a dealership or a chain. She told it without ornament, the way someone tells a story they have already told themselves many times in the dark to make sure they still believe it. Jake listened without interrupting. When she finished, he told her what he had found under the car. Serena's expression didn't break, but something behind her eyes shifted the particular look of a person whose worst hypothesis has just been confirmed. "The car was serviced 9 days ago," she said. "Authorized garage. Company account." Jake nodded slowly. That meant whoever had done this had access to Caldwell Logistics' internal vendor network. This wasn't opportunistic. It was planned, resourced, and executed by someone who understood both automotive systems and how to make sabotage look like wear. He slid the USB drive across the table toward her, without speaking. She looked at it, then at him. "You didn't open it," she said. "It has my name on it. That's not the same as an invitation." Serena reached into the inner pocket of her blazer and set down a folded sheet of paper, a printed page from an NTSB case registry. Jake's name was in the investigator field. The case number had been redacted, but the date was visible. 3 years ago, 2 months before he left the agency. "I found a closed investigation," she said. "A mechanical failure analyst who documented evidence of deliberate brake sabotage on a vehicle involved in a fatal single-car accident. The case was flagged for review and then quietly archived. The analyst resigned shortly after." She looked at him directly. "I spent 11 days finding out where that analyst went." Jake looked at the paper for a long time. "What's on the drive?" he said. It wasn't a question. Financial records, transaction logs, evidence of a coordinated scheme to defraud the company and manufacture grounds for a forced CEO removal. Serena kept her voice even, but the precision in it had an edge, the edge of someone who had been building toward this conversation for weeks. "I extracted the files from the company server using a contractor's credentials and a company VPN at 2 in the morning. Jake leaned back in his chair. "Then it's worthless," he said. "All of it." Serena said nothing. "You're the CEO," Jake continued, "but unauthorized access to a protected system is still unauthorized access under federal law. Doesn't matter whose name is on the building. A good defense attorney gets every file on that drive thrown out before the first hearing. You'd be handing them the argument they need to flip this entire thing around on you." The room was quiet. Outside, a car moved slowly down the road. "I know," Serena said finally. "That's why I needed the car." Jake understood then. The USB drive and the financial records were never meant to be the case. They were the map. The car was the evidence, physical, documented, undeniable, with a chain of custody that had never left his hands. A sabotaged brake line on a vehicle serviced through a company vendor, examined by a former NTSB investigator, filed under federal forensic protocol. That was something a defense attorney couldn't dissolve with a procedural argument, but only if Jake was the one who filed it. He looked at the certification frame on the desk, right side up now, the way he had set it the night before, in the 40 seconds between finding the envelope and deciding to open it. "There are people who already know I have this car," he said. "Yes," Serena said. "And they know what I do for a living." "Yes." "Then they know what I found." Serena met his eyes and didn't look away. "That's also why I'm here early." Jake stood up and walked to the doorway. In the back room, Rosie was starting to stir. He could hear the small sounds of a child waking up, the soft thump of feet hitting the floor the bear probably dragged along behind her. In 45 minutes, she needed to be at school. He had a full day of work booked. He had built this life to stay exactly this size. He turned back to Serena. "I'll need the vehicle documentation," he said. "Service records going back 18 months. Every vendor authorization on file." He moved to the pegboard and lifted a fresh pair of gloves from the hook. And I need you to understand, if I file this report, I file it the right way. Full federal forensic protocol. That means it goes to the FBI field office and the NTSB regional office simultaneously. That means it becomes a federal matter before your board ever sees it. I know, Serena said. I'm not doing this for your company. She looked at him steadily. I know that too. Jake pulled on the first glove, then the second. He walked back toward the garage where the Range Rover was still on the lift and the brake line was still waiting, and 12 years of work had just bent back toward the 9 years before it. From the back room, Rosie called out that she couldn't find her other shoe. Check under the sofa, Jake called back, his voice even. It's always under the sofa. He picked up his flashlight and got back to work. The gray sedan was a late-model Chevrolet. Nothing remarkable, the kind of car that was designed to disappear in traffic. Jake noticed it 2 blocks from Rosie's school, parked facing the wrong direction on a one-way residential street engine, running no one visibly waiting nearby. He kept driving. At the next intersection, he turned right instead of left, looped around a hardware store parking lot, and came back down a parallel street. The sedan had moved. It was now half a block behind him. He drove 3 more minutes without speaking. Rosie was in the passenger seat, talking about a science project. Something about cloud formations, her voice easy and unaware. Jake changed direction twice. More, pulled into a convenience store, and sat in the lot for 4 minutes with the engine idling. The sedan did not reappear. He took a longer route to school. When he dropped Rosie off at the front entrance, he watched her walk through the doors before he pulled away, and he kept watching through the rearview mirror until the doors closed behind her. It took everything he had to keep his hand steady on the wheel. 8 years old, a stuffed bear in her backpack, a cloud formation project due on Friday. She had no frame of reference for what a gray sedan meant, or why her father had taken 3 wrong turns getting her to school. She trusted the world to be the size he had made it for her. That trust was the thing Jake couldn't afford to lose. On the drive back, he called Calvin Ross. Calvin had spent 14 years as a detective with the Mecklenburg County Sheriff's Office before a knee injury and a difficult divorce had pushed him toward private work. He and Jake had met during the Sarah investigation. Calvin had been the one local contact willing to look at the crash site alongside Jake after the NTSB closed the file. They hadn't found enough, but Calvin had kept every note, and Jake had never forgotten that. Gray Chevrolet sedan, Jake said when Calvin answered. No plates visible. Sitting outside Rosie's school pickup area this afternoon. Followed us for about 6 blocks. Calvin's voice was careful. You sure it was a tail and not just a parent running late? It repositioned twice when I changed routes. How bad is this thing you're in? I filed a federal forensic report this morning, Jake said. Brake line sabotage on a vehicle connected to an active fraud investigation. The woman whose car it is, she's about to walk into a board vote that could remove her from her own company. The people who want her out arranged for her car to fail on the highway. And they know you filed. They know I found it. Filing was only a matter of time after that. Calvin said he would start digging on the sedan and asked Jake to send him everything he had on the vendor chain tied to the vehicle service record. Jake agreed. Before he hung up, Calvin said something that Jake had already been thinking. Since the convenience store parking lot, whoever was watching Rosie wasn't watching her because they wanted information. They were watching her because they wanted Jake to know they could. That was a different kind of message than a scored brake line. That was personal. Jake got back to the shop, locked the front bay, and sat at his desk for a long time. The certification frame stood upright on the desk, catching a thin line of afternoon light from the side window. He thought about Rosie's voice in the car, easy and unaware, talking about clouds. He thought about the 3 years he had spent arranging a life small enough that nothing could reach through it and take something from him again. He had been so careful. He had been so deliberate about every choice, every boundary, every door he kept closed. And still here was a gray sedan outside an elementary school. He started building the supplemental forensic file at 3 in the afternoon and worked until past midnight. Derek Ashford arrived on the third morning. Jake heard the cars before he saw them, 2 vehicles pulling into the gravel lot at 6:40, moving slower than delivery traffic, the sound of doors opening without urgency. He set down his coffee and walked to the bay window. Derek was silver-haired, dressed in a charcoal suit that cost more than Jake's monthly revenue. He wore a Rolex on his left wrist and carried nothing in his hands, the particular posture of a man who had spent decades letting other people carry things for him. The 2 men who came with him wore street clothes and stood slightly apart from each other in the practiced way of people who wanted to seem casual and didn't quite manage it. Jake unlocked the bay door and stepped out into the early morning cold. Derek smiled. It was the kind of smile that had nothing behind it. "Mr. Mercer." His voice was measured, almost warm. "I apologize for coming by unannounced. I'm Derek Ashford, COO at Caldwell Logistics. I believe you have one of our company vehicles." "Had," Jake said. "Owner picked it up yesterday." Derek's smile adjusted slightly, the way a calculation adjusts when a variable changes. "Of course. I'm actually here because Ms. Caldwell has some obligations back at the office that require her immediate attention. Internal matters. Time-sensitive." He let that sit for a moment. "We'd appreciate your discretion regarding anything discussed during her visit." Jake looked at Derek the way he looked at engine components he didn't trust, not hostile, just precise. The forensic report went to the FBI field office and the NTSB regional office at 6:45 this morning, Jake said. A second copy was filed with the federal court clerk as supporting documentation in an ongoing securities investigation. The physical evidence is currently in 3 separate locations, none of which is this property. He kept his voice the way he kept his workspace clean and without excess. "And if anything happens to my daughter, a 4th copy goes to the Washington Post at midnight tonight. Automatically. I set that up before I went to bed." Derek's smile did not disappear, but something behind his eyes went very still. The 2 men in street clothes exchanged a look that they probably thought was subtle. Derek straightened the cuff of his jacket, a small, precise movement, and said that he hoped Jake understood he was simply trying to resolve a difficult internal situation as smoothly as possible. Jake said nothing. Derek left. The gravel crunched under his shoes as he walked back to the car. The 2 men followed. The vehicles pulled out of the lot and turned north on the 2-lane road without rushing. Jake stood in the bay opening until they were out of sight. Then he went inside and called Serena. "Ashford was here," he said. "I know." Her voice was tight in a way it hadn't been before. "He moved the vote. It's in 48 hours, not 10 days. He's been working the board for weeks. He has at least 7 members committed." A beat. "They have a document. A signed asset transfer authorization for $60 million, company letterhead, my signature. I've never seen it before." Jake pulled out his chair and sat down slowly. A forged document distributed to 12 board members, presented alongside a manufactured leadership crisis, in a room where the outcome had already been negotiated in advance. Ashford had been building this architecture for months. The brake line had been meant to make sure Serena never reached that room at all. 48 hours, Jake said. "Yes. Then we need to talk about what you're going to walk in there with." They worked through most of the following day at the shop, the door locked. Calvin picked Rosie up from school and took her to a diner 2 miles away, keeping her there with a burger and a stack of napkins she could draw on. Jake trusted Calvin with exactly 2 things. In the world information he needed verified and his daughter's physical safety. This was the first time he had asked for the second. Serena sat at Jake's desk and worked through the documentation, while Jake moved between the office and the garage building, the evidentiary sequence in the order it would need to be presented. The forensic report was the foundation physical evidence chain of custody intact, filed under federal protocol, impossible to dismiss as internal company politics. On top of that, Serena had something else. 3 weeks before the break line, before she had found Jake's name in the NTSB registry, she had forwarded a separate complaint to the Securities and Exchange Commission through an outside attorney she trusted. The complaint documented a coordinated acquisition scheme, a foreign investment vehicle quietly accumulating leverage over Caldwell Logistics through a network of intermediary contracts with Derek Ashford and the company's legal counsel orchestrating the structure from inside. That legal counsel was a man named Philip Crane, who had served as the company's external advisor for 7 years and attended every board meeting as a matter of routine. The SEC had acknowledged receipt. The case had a number. That number combined with the forensic report and an internal email chain that Serena's attorney had obtained through legitimate discovery proceedings. Server metadata, login IP, addresses timestamps gave them 3 things that could stand in front of a board and not collapse under a procedural challenge. None of it guaranteed the vote. 7 committed board members were 7 committed board members. But it changed the room, and changing the room was all they had. Crane will be there, Serena said, looking at the email chain on her screen. He's been Ashford's legal cover for the entire scheme. If he's in that room, when the SEC filing is presented, he's going to know exactly how exposed he is. Jake thought about that. He picked up his phone and called Calvin again, gave him Crane's name and the SEC case number, and asked for a specific kind of coordination, the kind that required a federal contact Calvin had cultivated during his years with the sheriff's office. Calvin said he would need until the following morning. Jake said that was fine. He hung up and looked at Serena across the desk. "You're going in there alone," he said. "I know. I can't be in that room. A mechanic showing up at a board meeting doesn't help you. It gives Ashford a narrative. Outside technical influence, improper access to internal proceedings. He'll use it." "I know," Serena said again. There was no frustration in it, just acknowledgement. She had already understood this. She understood most things before they were finished being said, which Jake had noticed and filed away without comment. It was the same quality he had valued in good investigators, the ability to receive information without needing it re-explained. "Calvin will be outside the building," Jake said. "He knows what to do and when." Serena nodded. She looked at the 3 items open on her screen, the forensic report, the email chain with its metadata intact, the SEC acknowledgement with its case number, and then she closed the laptop with the careful movement of someone preparing for something they cannot fully prepare for. "My father used to say that the only way to hold a room is to walk in already knowing what you're willing to lose," she said. Jake looked at her. "What are you willing to lose?" Serena considered the question seriously, the way it deserved. "Not the company," she said. "My father built it with 30 years, and a fleet of 12 trucks, and a phone he answered himself on weekends. I'm not losing it to a man who spent 11 years learning how to take it apart from the inside." She met Jake's eyes. "What about you?" Jake thought about Rosie at the diner with Calvin drawing on napkins, not knowing why her afternoon had been rerouted. He thought about the sedan outside the school. He thought about the certification frame standing upright on the desk. "I already know what I lost," he said. "I'm here to find out if what I do next is worth it." Neither of them said anything after that. Outside, the last light of the afternoon went flat against the shop windows, and somewhere down the 2-lane road, a truck shifted gears and moved on, and the sound faded until the only thing left was the work waiting in front of them. The board meeting was set for 9 in the morning, 41 hours after Derek Ashford had stood in Jake's gravel lot and delivered a threat dressed as a courtesy call. Serena arrived at the Caldwell Logistics building at 8:45. She took the elevator to the 14th floor alone. The lobby outside the boardroom was already occupied. 2 of Ashford's committed members were speaking in low voices near the window, and they stopped when she walked past. She did not slow down. Inside the boardroom table seated 14. 12 members were present. Derek sat at the far end in a chair that was not technically the head of the table, but had been positioned to function as one. Philip Crane sat 2 seats to his left, with a leather portfolio open in front of him. Pen already out, a man who had attended enough of these meetings to know exactly where to position himself. When Serena sat down, Derek reached into a document folder and began distributing bound copies of the Asset Transfer Authorization Company, letterhead Caldwell Logistics, watermark paper, her forged signature on the signature line. He set a copy in front of each board member with the practiced efficiency of a man who had choreographed this moment many times in his head. Then he gestured toward Serena with the measured courtesy of someone who believed the outcome was already settled. "Ms. Caldwell," he said, "the floor is yours." Serena opened her laptop. She had 3 things on the screen, and she needed all 3 to land in the right order, in a room where 7 of the 12 people sitting around her had already made up their minds. She had one shot at this. There was no Calvin behind her, no Jake at the door, no procedural mechanism that would stop the vote once it began. She looked at the screen. She looked at the 12 faces around the table. Then she started talking. Serena started with the car, not with the financial records, not with the SEC filing, with the car, because the car was the thing no one in that room could argue away with a procedural challenge or a forged signature. She pulled up the forensic report on the projector screen. 16 pages, federal header case number visible in the top right corner of every page. The author line read, "Jacob Mercer, Certified Mechanical Failure Analyst, former NTSB Investigative Division, 9 years of service." She walked the room through it methodically. The scoring pattern on the rear hydraulic brake line, the instrument precision required to achieve that specific wall thickness, the calculated failure window of 150 to 200 kilometers at highway speed. She explained that the vehicle had been serviced 9 days prior through an authorized Caldwell Logistics vendor. She explained that the vendor authorization logs were part of the federal evidence package already in FBI possession. She did not editorialize. She let the technical language do what technical language does in a room full of people who understand numbers. It removed the possibility of dismissal. 3 of the 7 committed members had stopped looking at Derek before she finished the first section. Then she moved to the emails. The internal correspondence between Derek Ashford and Philip Crane had been obtained through legitimate discovery proceedings by her outside attorney, authenticated against the company's own server metadata and the IP addresses on record for both men's corporate login credentials. The emails documented across a period of 8 months a coordinated timeline for what Derek had internally referred to as a leadership transition, a phrase that appeared 11 times across 14 messages, alongside contract routing instructions, board contact schedules, and a reference to an outside acquisition vehicle that Crane had described in one message as the primary beneficiary of a streamlined ownership structure. Serena read that phrase aloud and let it sit in the room. A board member near the center of the table, a woman named Patricia Holloway, who had known Gerald Caldwell for 20 years, set down her pen. The third item was the SEC filing. Serena displayed the acknowledgement letter on the screen, case number, date of receipt, the name of the supervising examiner assigned to the matter. An active securities fraud investigation already opened, already staffed, already in motion. Whatever happened in this room in the next 30 minutes, that investigation would continue regardless. Derek had been quiet through all of it. He had the stillness of a man who had been in difficult rooms before and knew that the person who speaks first after a silence often loses it. When Serena finished and closed her presentation slide, he took a measured breath and straightened in his chair. He was good. Jake had been right about that. Derek acknowledged the forensic report with the careful language of someone who respected the process while questioning the framing. A former employee with a personal grievance, he suggested a report filed under circumstances that warranted independent scrutiny before any conclusions could be drawn. He addressed the emails by noting that internal planning discussions about organizational structure were a normal function of executive leadership, that the phrase leadership transition reflected legitimate governance concerns about a company navigating a difficult period following the unexpected death of its founder. He said the words fiduciary responsibility twice in 3 sentences. He said stability 4 times. His voice stayed even. His hands stayed still. He spoke the way a man speaks when he has spent months preparing for a single room and believes that preparation is enough. 3 of the previously uncommitted board members were leaning slightly toward him by the time he reached his second point. One of the 4 who had been against Serena from the start was nodding at intervals that were just visible enough to be intentional. Derek was almost all the way through his rebuttal, almost at the point where the room's momentum would tip and stay tipped when the boardroom door opened. Calvin Ross walked in wearing a jacket that had seen better years, moving with the unhurried gait of a man who had entered difficult rooms before and knew that urgency was a signal you didn't want to broadcast. The federal contact he had reached through his years with the sheriff's office had come through that morning. Behind him, a woman in a dark blazer carried a leather document wallet and a federal credentials holder that she set on the table without introduction. Special Agent Dana Whitfield, FBI, Charlotte Field Office. She was there, she said, to serve a material witness summons on Philip Crane in connection with an active federal investigation into securities fraud and conspiracy to commit aggravated assault. The summons had been issued that morning. The investigation referenced the same case number currently displayed on the projector screen behind Serena. Philip Crane looked at the document for a long moment. Then he closed his leather portfolio, capped his pen, stood up, and walked out of the room without speaking to anyone. He did not look at Derek. Derek's voice, mid-sentence when the door had opened, did not resume. The room was completely still. The vote took 11 minutes. 8 members in favor of retaining Serena Caldwell as CEO. 4 opposed. The motion to remove failed. Patricia Holloway called for an immediate audit committee review under independent oversight, and 6 hands went up before she finished the sentence. The meeting adjourned. Derek Ashford left without the composure he had arrived with. He walked past Serena without acknowledgement. His jaw set his eyes on the middle distance of a man recalculating a future that had just been significantly revised. 2 of his 4 remaining committed votes left with him. The others stayed in their chairs looking at the table or the window or anywhere that wasn't the door Derek had just walked through. Serena closed her laptop. She sat still for a moment at the head of the table, not in triumph, but in the quiet that follows. Something that required everything. The bound copies of the forged authorization were still in front of each seat, her false signature facing up at 12 different angles. She did not touch them. Patricia Holloway crossed the room and put a hand briefly on her shoulder before leaving. No one said much. There wasn't much to say. The room emptied in the way rooms empty after difficult things, people gathering their papers and their phones, making brief eye contact, and then looking away, moving toward the door with the slightly hurried quality of people who are glad to be elsewhere. Serena stayed in her chair until the last board member had gone. Then she sat alone at a table that still held Gerald Caldwell's name on a brass placard at the far end. The placard that no one had moved in 14 months because no one had been certain enough of anything to move it. Calvin was waiting in the lobby when she came out. He handed her a coffee from a cart near the elevator bank. "Your mechanic's good," he said. "He's thorough," Serena said. Calvin smiled at that, the kind of smile that meant he'd noticed something he wasn't going to say out loud. He rode down in the elevator with her and walked her to her car, and before she drove away, he told her that the federal indictments against Derek Ashford and Philip Crane were expected within 60 days, 11 counts between them, covering securities, fraud, financial manipulation, conspiracy to commit aggravated assault, and corporate document forgery. The foreign investment fund that had been positioned to benefit from the Caldwell acquisition was now itself the subject of an independent federal investigation. Serena drove back toward the east side of the city. The morning had gone sharp and clear, the kind of fall light that makes Charlotte look like it was designed rather than built. She thought about her father and his fleet of 12 trucks, and the phone he answered on weekends, and the way he used to say that the difference between a company and a business was whether the people running it understood what they were actually protecting. She thought she understood now more than she had 14 months ago. It was late afternoon by the time she pulled back into the gravel lot of Mercer's Auto and Repair. The shop was open. She could hear tools from inside, the specific sound of someone working without distraction. Methodical, unhurried, the rhythm of a person who finds something close to peace in the precision of mechanical work. She recognized it because her father had had the same quality in his office, the same capacity for stillness inside motion. She walked in. Jake was under a sedan on the lift, but he heard the Range Rover on the gravel. She could tell by the way the work sounds shifted a brief recalibration, and he rolled out and stood up. He was in his work clothes, hands already moving toward the shop rag on the bench before he consciously decided to. Serena set 2 envelopes on the counter. The first one he could identify by weight and thickness. He didn't open it. The second one, she said, is a proposal. Independent Safety Certification Program for the full Caldwell Logistics fleet. Every vehicle, every service cycle. Reports go directly to the CEO. No intermediate review, no vendor self-certification. She looked at him steadily. I need someone who doesn't have a reason to stop when someone asks them to stop. Jake picked up the second envelope. He turned it over once in his hands without opening it. Let me think about it, he said. Serena nodded. I know. She held his gaze for one moment longer than was strictly necessary, not with warmth exactly, but with recognition, the acknowledgement between 2 people who have been in the same difficult place at the same time, and come out the other side, knowing something about each other that doesn't require explanation. Then she turned and walked back to the Range Rover and drove east until the shop disappeared behind the tree line. Jake was still standing at the counter when his phone rang. Calvin's name on the screen. He answered. FBI called me an hour ago, Calvin said. They want you in Washington next week. The investment fund behind Ashford's acquisition scheme, it has a subsidiary, a holding company that owned a partial stake in an automotive service vendor network operating in western North Carolina. Calvin let that settle for a moment before he continued. The same vendor network that serviced Sarah's car 3 years ago. Their forensic accounting team found the connection this morning. Jake did not move. The accident file is being reopened as an active investigation, Calvin said. Federal level. They need your documentation. Your original NTSB field notes, everything you kept from the original case. They're asking if you're available. A beat. I told them I'd check. Jake stood at the counter for a long time without speaking. Through the window, the afternoon light came down long and gold across the shop floor, catching the edges of the tools on the pegboard, the clean concrete, the corner of the desk where the certification frame stood right side up, the way it had been standing for 4 days now, since the night he turned it over and picked up a stranger's envelope and stepped back into the work he had tried to leave behind. 3 years. He had spent 3 years building a life small enough that nothing could reach into it. And here was the answer he had stopped letting himself ask for, arriving through a phone pressed against a wall in a 2-bay garage on a road that most people drove past without slowing down. From the back room, Rosie's voice drifted through the open doorway, a small, formless song, the kind children sing when they're not thinking about singing, when they're just present and safe and unaware of the distance between their world and the one that exists just outside it. Jake listened to her for a moment. Then he looked at the second envelope on the counter. Then at the certification frame. Then at nothing in particular at the middle distance, where a person looks when they are measuring something that doesn't have a unit. "Send me the information," he said. He set the phone down. He picked up the second envelope and held it without opening it, standing in the doorway between the shop and the back room, between the work he had built to stay small and the work that had found him anyway. Rosie's song continued unhurried and unbroken, carrying the particular quality of sounds made by people who do not yet know what is waiting, who exist for now, entirely inside the moment they are in. Jake set the envelope down on the desk, beside the certification frame. He picked up his flashlight. He went back to work.